Democracy, Terrorism and Modern Life, 10 points, Spring 2020. Number 1, Stern. Jessica Stern is the bedrock of the course. She provides our understanding of modern terrorism. She's very good at the underlying psychology. It's an attack on the public. It's rooted in ideology and/or religion. It's often expressed as irredentist claims to long-lost land. Violence is the outcome of a lack of political process. There's no formal mechanism for negotiating grievances. A cycle of violence has been established, alternating provocations by guerrillas and retribution from security services. Other states have been drawn in and are pursuing their own narrow interests by sponsoring different factions among the guerrillas. Most important, there is a terrorist production process, the TPP. Terrorists have to be recruited, trained, and targeted. International terrorist networks have a lot in common with multinational corporations. They have franchises, logistics, fundraising, and propaganda arms. Our main models of modern terrorism were the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Al-Qaeda in 9/11. Number 2, the War on Terror, the longest war in American history, and it just keeps dragging on and on. 2 phases: offensive phase, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq; defensive phase, efforts to contain the resulting civil wars. 2 shifts, from regular army to special forces, from human intelligence to drones. Obama, contradictory, drew down troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, but ramped up the intermediate posture elsewhere. Finally caught and killed bin Laden, but did not succeed in closing Guantanamo. Wars are easy to start, difficult to end. As a result, America is stuck in an open-ended campaign against international terrorist networks. We are able to contain them with drones and special forces, but not to defeat them or affect the circumstances that produce them. Trump is caught between Obama and Bush, on the one hand abandoning the Kurds and Syria, on the other hand lashing out at the Iranians and killing Soleimani. What Trump has added is the nationalist twist of equating Islam with terrorism and of identifying foreigners with disease. You have to wonder how America's campaign against terrorist networks is going to fare in light of our turning our backs on multinational efforts to find a vaccine for the virus. Number 3, lone wolves. We went through the business about the media reporting process for mass shootings and the way perpetrators use features from this script to create a narrative for themselves. The big breakthrough in this class was the idea of thinking about 2 types of lone wolves. There's the type where the perpetrator clearly suffered from abnormal psychology, Sandy Hook, the Batman shooter in Aurora, Colorado, the Las Vegas shooter. But then there's the type where the perpetrator draws inspiration from white supremacist or Islamist ideology, the Boston bombers, the Charleston and El Paso shooters. As you kept pointing out, these are not really lone wolves as much as they're wolves who have been sent by the pack. So we'll call this postmodern terrorism, but we've established that there are 2 different types. Number 4, solutions. This is the part we didn't get to finish, but where we were making greater headway than any previous class. The modern terrorism of multinational terrorist networks is clearly still a job for the campaign against terrorism. Let's not call it the war on terror. You're not going to stop the flow of refugees from Central America by building a wall. You can only stop it by helping those countries cope with climate change so they can keep their own people at home. Postmodern terrorism overlaps with modern terrorism insofar as multinational networks can reach out and radicalize perpetrators. But postmodern terrorism is mainly committed by perpetrators looking to use the script of the media reporting process to go out in a blaze of gore. A Hollywood production code for the media reporting process might help. Don't name the perpetrator. Respect the victims' families. It might help cable news establish a calmer, less agitated tone for reporting mass shootings. Classifying gun violence as a public health issue might also help. It's not about the Second Amendment. It's about making sure firearms only get into the hands of young people who have been trained and who have responsible adults who can vouch for them. So there are two types of terrorism. One, overseas, which we can contain by improving our efforts to address the underlying conditions that generate terrorist organization. The second, domestic, which we can contain by engendering more responsible behavior from our media and better interventions from our schools. Number 5, Pakistan, theatres of conflict. If you think of terrorism by analogy with geology and plate tectonics, then terrorism flares up where colonial plates are withdrawing. Pakistan and Syria and Iraq are all states created when colonial powers were withdrawing. These are the kinds of states where the government has never controlled all of its territory. There is no overarching national identity. The state has been captured by one group which uses its powers to suppress rivals. The military is the most powerful organization in the country, and the state's budget is dependent on international aid. It's far from what Americans understand as good governance, well, up until the virus hit, but it's what most of the world's population have to put up with. In Pakistan's case, it has produced a fascinating society which is pre-modern, modern, and postmodern at the same time. Once you understand Pakistan's origins in the Muslim split with Hindu India, and you grasp the complexity of its geographical situation and the way the Pashtuns straddle the border with Afghanistan, you begin to see why they have no choice but to string the Americans along. Number 6, Syria. Syria is the hardest subject I have to teach. It's even harder than what Americans call race. It's so complicated. No wonder Trump just gave up. There's no way you can summarize this conflict on 2 pages and in less than 10 minutes. It's especially hard this year because there were rapid developments during the class. The Americans left the table. The Turks moved in to finish off the Kurds and protect the Syrian rebels in Idlib, and now they are in a face down with the Syrian army and the Russian Air Force. Meantime, the virus is moving into a country with very little in the way of a public health system. You know, you have to wonder, given the inevitable impact of the virus on the social structure wherever it goes, whether Syria's and Sudan's and Somalia's fates won't be Iran's and Pakistan's and Russia's in the near future. Though far from being the exception, this is what broken states will look like. Venezuela as a harbinger of what is to come. Number 7, Russia. I thought you would switch off by the time we got to Putin. Pakistan is hard because it is so different. Syria is ludicrously complicated. By comparison, Vladimir Putin is such a grade A Bond villain, he's hard to take seriously. As he said of Gesson's book, who could believe one man could do so much? But quite the contrary, your postings and essays made it clear you thought Putin is at the heart of our problem with terror. As a student put it the other year, Vladimir Putin, control what they can see, talk over what they can say. For years this worked well enough when Russia's oil economy was expanding. Putin had the cash to flash, and he invested in new weapons and ramped up his investments in domestic opposition overseas. Russia got Crimea back, gave Ukraine a bloody nose, and pushed the US out of the Middle East. But now the virus has broken out. The oil price has fallen through the floor, literally. All over the world, employees and their employers are getting a crash course on how you don't need to commute so much. Plus, Russians are like Americans when it comes to public health. That's somebody else's problem. Number 8, authoritarianism. Is liberal democracy dying? Yes, nationalists are not Democrats because they don't recognize the whole of the population as citizens. Since the 1980s, the political economy has only been able to produce a decent living for the educated half of the population. For an entire generation now, we've had nothing but penury to offer the working class. What's amazing is that we still have faith in voting to change anything. Is authoritarianism on the rise? Yes, not in the least, because the tools that make Facebook and YouTube so useful for advertisers are a huge boon for dictators. It's way easier than having secret policemen following around everyone with an opinion. Also, most of the public around the world still gets its view of the wider world from television. Control television and you can bottle up the intellectuals on the internet. Okay, all that was true at the beginning of the course, but what about now in the wake of the virus? It seems to me that the response to the virus has cut across this division between liberal democracies and dictatorships. Whether you're a liberal democracy or a dictatorship has not been the decisive variable. It's been the capacity to generate national consensus and mobilize the population, often on the basis of prior experience of infectious disease. Here's a list of the states that have done well so far. The Chinese, the South Koreans, Taiwan, Singapore, the Germans, even India, African and Caribbean countries that have had long experience with infectious diseases. Now that the virus is endemic, these are the countries that are on the road to adaptation. You can also add Australia and New Zealand to this list, although it helps to be islands on the other side of the planet. The countries that have done poorly are all characterized by marked regional conflicts, ideological disarray, and political logjams caused by the rise of nationalist politics. Here's a list of the states that have done poorly so far: Italy, Spain, Britain, Russia, and the nation with the bigliest numbers, the United States. Now that the virus is endemic, these are the countries which are only just beginning to adapt. Number 9, democracy and modern life. Ed and Danny were right all along. Ed kept telling us the pandemic was coming, and Danny kept telling me it was way more serious than the common cold. There was never any so what about this threat. Yes, the virus is another form of terror, like the terrorists who can reach out and murder you for an arbitrary cause. The risk is always out there. It's the spectacular scale that distinguishes terror from the more mundane and more likely everyday threats like bath mats and box cutters and crossing the street. This form of terror will require more adaptation than the terrorism we have faced in the past. This adaptation is more on a scale of post-war recovery from the Great Depression and World War II. That post-war recovery involved constructing the machinery to support peak in the first place. That's hot and cold running water, supermarket food, and 24/7 electricity. The recovery from the virus will involve re-engineering peak with a small footprint. That is likely to be no less of a challenge, but one which we would not have grappled with had it not been for the virus. The story of New York is of steady growth interrupted by periodic crises. In the 20th century alone, there was World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the 1977 blackout and riots, 9/11, and 2008 and the Great Recession. Modern life is about peaks and troughs, surmounting one great crisis after another. The only common characteristic seems to be that we never see the next crisis coming. Number 10, the pandemic. The virus is a timely warning of what we're doing to nature by tearing through the Earth's natural resources at the present rate. There will likely be another pandemic in our lifetimes, this time melting out of the permafrost in Siberia. Viruses are nature's way of throwing a spanner in the works and forcing the pace of evolution. For liberal democracies with their hard-won flexibility, this is a chance to rewrite the social contract, diminish our dependency on fossil fuels, and find new and more environmentally friendly ways of manufacturing, consuming, and recycling. I wonder if nationalists and dictators will adapt as well, given their stifling need for conformity and control. Since we might be shut in at home for the better part of 2 years, nature has given us plenty of time to think about it.